December 20th, 1943. The kind of winter morning where Europe feels made of iron and ice. On a crowded airfield at RAF Kimballton in England, 10 young men climbed into a Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress that carried an almost playful name, Ye Olde Pub. It was their first mission together as a full crew. The target was anything but playful. The heavily defended Focke-Wulf aircraft plant in Bremen, Germany, one of the industrial hearts feeding the Luftwaffe. 20-year-old Second Lieutenant Charles Charlie Brown from West Virginia slid into the left seat. Beside him was co-pilot Spencer Pinky Luke. Up front in the plexiglass nose, navigator Al Sadok and bombardier Robert Andy Andrews prepared their charts and bombsight. Behind them, top turret gunner and flight engineer Bertrand Frenchy Coulomb watched over the engines. Radio operator Richard Dick Petchout checked his set. In the belly, ball turret gunner Samuel Blackie squeezed into his tiny sphere. Along the fuselage, waist gunners Lloyd Jennings and Alex Russian Yelisenko checked their .5 calibers. And all the way in the back, tail gunner Hugh Ecke Eckenrode took his lonely post, the last line of defense against fighters coming from behind. The briefing that morning had been blunt. Expect hundreds of German fighters and some of the heaviest flak over all of Germany. Bremen was guarded by more than 250 anti-aircraft guns. Bomber crews had a dark nickname for exposed positions in the formation. One of those spots was called Purple Heart Corner, the place where aircraft drew more fire and where crews were more likely to be hit. That's where Ye Olde Pub was initially assigned. Later, after several bombers aborted with mechanical issues, Brown's crew was moved even closer to the front of the formation, an honor that also made them a brighter target. Hours later, at around 8,000 meters over Germany, the formation droned toward Bremen in air so cold it could freeze exposed skin in seconds, about -60 degrees Celsius. Inside the pub, the men spoke in clipped phrases over intercom, each hiding his own private fear behind routine checks and gallows humor. Outside, contrails drew white scars across the sky, as hundreds of Allied bombers and escorts pushed deeper into enemy territory. Then the flak began. Black puffs of bursting shells appeared around the formation, first distant, then uncomfortably close. Each explosion sent jagged steel fragments spraying outward, indifferent to courage or experience. The bomber shook with every near miss. On the 10-minute bomb run, when the formation had to hold a straight, predictable course so the bombardiers could aim, Ye Olde Pub took 2 brutal hits. One burst shattered the nose, blowing out the plexiglass and turning the front of the aircraft into a screaming wind tunnel. Another shell tore into the wing and engines, knocking out engine number 2 and further damaging number 4, which was already unreliable and now had to be throttled back to avoid overspeed. Inside, oxygen lines were cut, electrical systems damaged, and the heating in some gun positions failed. In the tail, the worst happened. Eckenrode, the man guarding their 6 o'clock, was killed almost instantly when a shell struck near his position. The crew felt the impact as a sickening jolt. They did not have time to mourn, they barely had time to understand. In combat, grief is a luxury. Survival is the only task. Still, Brown kept the aircraft on the bomb run. Against logic, against instinct, the pub dropped its bombs on target as ordered. Only then did the real nightmare begin. The damage had slowed the B-17 dramatically. As the formation turned away from Bremen, Ye Olde Pub began to fall behind, slipping out of the protective box of overlapping guns. In bomber warfare, there is one rule every crew learns on their first mission: do not become a straggler. Now, Ye Olde Pub was exactly that, alone, wounded, and silhouetted against the winter sky. And German fighters had seen it. Ye Olde Pub was no longer a bomber. It was a testimony suspended in the air. A steel survivor gasping for oxygen, veering slightly left with every attempt to keep balance, its nose open like a coin-torn wound. When the first engine died, the crew compensated with power from the other 3. But now 2 engines were limping, fuel lines rattling, one wing heavier, hydraulics unreliable, and a pilot wounded. They were flying by muscle and prayer, but mostly by instinct and engineering. At these heights, a flak hit was not just damage. It was disassembly performed mid-air. Unlike fighter duels, where aircraft met machine gun spray in brief exchanges, bomber formations flew through fields of explosions sewn into the sky. Flak batteries aimed ahead of the formation, creating massive kill zones, turning the airspace into an invisible minefield. Bremen was especially feared. The North Sea coastline near Bremen was wrapped in layered defenses. Allied strategists considered it a necessary risk. Strike the production hard, accept the casualties, preserve the momentum. Yet, Ye Olde Pub proved that necessity does not equal destiny. Brown tightened his seat harness as searing pain dragged through his shoulder. The intercom crackled with clipped, tense voices reporting failures. The crew didn't know how long they could maintain oxygen pressure. Above 8,000 meters, hypoxia steals judgment slowly, like fog filling a brain. Their masks were working, but the aircraft system was not. Then came the wolves. A pack of Luftwaffe fighters descended, first dots, then crosses, then full silhouettes with predatory intent. Fighters did not attack at random. They cued their assaults in teams, approaching from blind angles, alternating fire, avoiding bomber lines of retaliation. But Brown had no retaliation to coordinate. He had only a limited number of guns operational, most too dangerous to fire because recoil or current surges might fully sever the systems keeping them airborne. One burst from fighters struck the top section. Another tore through the belly. The bomber shuddered. Coulomb manually throttled engines to avoid flameouts or overspin. Luke kept an eye on altitude, but altitude was no longer a number. It was a flood line, too low to climb, too high to land safely, yet somehow defying both. Still, the pub flew. Inside the plane, cold air pushed through gaps, causing the crew's breath to crystallize in unheated sections. Frost formed around rivets, oxygen frames, and metal edges. Waist gunners couldn't brace properly, one wound preventing stable posture. Bombardier Andrews tried restoring gun circuits manually. Petchout rewired radio lines hoping for a miracle signal. But miracles don't call. They arrive.
Stigler was the first to reach. The German fighter from Jagdgeschwader 27 peeled upward, sliding into sight. At first, Brown assumed this was the final countdown, a veteran Franz Stigler coming for his 28th kill. But this was not a kill approach. This was a question, a hesitation, a moment in war when a trigger finger pauses not from fear, but from humanity. And though Brown didn't know it yet, his fate had just been rewritten by a man he'd never met. Stigler flew parallel, close enough that a gloved hand could almost touch the bomber's skin of frozen steel. Brown saw the pilot gesture downward, land, set it down, this plane is already dead. But Brown shook his head. And Stigler did something history usually edits out of stories. He stayed. Not for glory, not for orders, but because the aircraft had crossed into a space where fighting back was impossible, yet surrendering wasn't chosen. And the pilot chasing them knew the truth. The bomber wasn't part of a duel anymore. It was a life raft in a frozen sky. Stigler had attacked bombers before, but not one already delivered its sacrifice. Franz Stigler had seen destruction. He had caused it, survived it, studied it. A Luftwaffe doctors once told young pilots that combat trauma lands in the body first, the mind later. This was the moment trauma chose a side. Stigler had that morning been grounded for refueling after an exhausting sortie over Bremen air defenses. His aircraft carried marks of previous victories. 27 confirmed kills in the log. The kind of number pilots repeat for reputation and survival insurance in the hierarchy. But December 20th brought no hierarchy, only geometry and conscience. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 was a machine built to climb, intercept, and dismantle. Yet in the mind of the ace flying it, a different model had engaged. ethics forged not in classrooms but combat lines. Stigler's squadron culture was one of strict obedience. His unit, Jagdgeschwader 27, had a reputation for feral precision. That reputation also built another truth. Deviation from orders meant punishment, not medals. When he closed in on Ye Olde Pub, Stigler expected smoke, maybe descending parachutes. What he saw instead contradicted every air engagement he had previously experienced. A bomber that had lost its nose, 2 engines damaged, oxygen trails leaking, gunners incapacitated, tail demolished, yet refusing descent. It didn't look like an enemy. It looked like an inevitability defying itself. This was something the usual winners of the sky didn't talk about. But Stigler wasn't flying into talk. He was flying into view. Brown, wounded American pilot inside a plane that should have quit, saw a German flyer raise a hand toward the ground, commanding descent. But Brown shook his head. He still hoped for England. That was the moment Stigler made a calculation no bomber intercept manual could decode. He would escort instead of attack. Not because Brown refused landing, but because the crew had clearly crossed into a state where victory offered no honor. In flyer doctrine, there existed something known but rarely spoken: the human rule above the waterline. Stigler had been instructed never to fire at pilots descending in parachutes. The planes descending, however, were usually another story. But Ye Olde Pub hadn't jumped out of itself. The crew had stayed in the wreckage to protect one another. So Stigler chose a new story. He tucked in beside the bomber, sliding into a synchronized flight line that made them look like a bent, wounded alphabet of war, riding its own survival clause. Stigler hoped his parallel formation would shield the bomber from coastal flak batteries as they approached the North Sea egress. The coast was especially trigger-happy at anything moving low and slow. Stigler didn't know if the bomber could make it across the coastline intact. He didn't know if the sea would finish what the sky began. But he knew this: if anyone else reached the coastline first, Ye Olde Pub would be a dead bird. So he flew beside it. A distance measured not in miles, but minutes stretching into survival decimals. Brown noticed the fighter reposition not to fire again, but to guard. The engines growled unevenly. The bomber maintained barely 1,000 feet. But the German fighter mirrored every shift, every groan, every vocal vibration coming from the limping bomber's side. And history did not yet know it, but the sky was invoking a verdict not written by the victors below. It was written by a pilot above. The decision had been made in silence, but silence itself roared. Stigler pushed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 into impossibly tight formation. His canopy framed a world that kept shrinking into the wounded silhouette of the B-17 Flying Fortress beside him. Brown's crew inside the bomber had given up climbing. The plane physically rejected altitude now. Every meter upward felt like negotiating with gravity, flame, and oxygen deficit. They could barely maintain 300 meters without stalling pressure in the fuel mix. Colomb manually managed engine balance, while Luke monitored a horizon that looked endless but was actually counting down in system failures. The fuselage diffused a constant scream of wind. The missing nose cone turned the aircraft into a frozen vacuum tunnel, robbing internal pressure at every mile. Brown's shoulder wound soaked through his flight jacket, stiffened by the cold. Pain doesn't burn in minus 60-degree air. It stabs and behaves like glass growing inward. The remaining gunners were wounded or unable to fire. Waist positions were essentially frozen open windows. Ball turret operator Blackford later recalled that the vibration of these moments traveled through the hull like Morse code tapped by death itself. Short bursts of chaos, long pauses of uncertainty. But the coast was closer. The deadly German flak network stretched from the inland factories to the harbors. These batteries used radar, visual spotting, timing prediction, and layered targeting corridors designed to shoot anything that broke formation and flew low. Bomber crews feared not just the shells, but the pattern, because patterns are easier to shoot than planes. Stigler knew Ye Olde Pub had broken all patterns, except one. It still flew west. So he gambled on the only remaining pattern that might save them. Imperial Japanese naval strategists once believed survival depended on formation discipline. German Air Command believed in brutal deterrence and ideological toughness. But individual pilots learned a different war rule. Survival sometimes rides beside the impossible. Stigler's intent was clear, though unspoken. If the bomber looked escorted, coastal flak batteries might hold fire long enough to give it a chance. To ground observers below, the sight would soon become unbelievable. A German Messerschmitt flying wing line beside a mortally damaged American B-17, refusing the hunter's angle, staying parallel like a pen escorting a wounded signature. They approached the coastline. The land below transitioned from factories, rivers, and snow-broken fields into ports and gray steel sea slicing into the sky. The North Sea appeared like a cold final paragraph, one more gauntlet to survive. Coastal flak stations locked on. Spotters visually confirmed silhouettes before firings. Radar blips prioritized unescorted aircraft. Fire control rooms issued final green lights. But when their radar sweeps identified a fighter wingman beside the bomber, targeting hesitated in the flak command lines. For the first time that morning, the pub benefited from hesitation in its favor. Inside the bomber, the crew saw nothing. They felt everything. The plane crossed the coastline without a single flak burst chasing them. Brown exhaled in a cold cockpit triumph that wasn't triumph at all, just survival leaving footprints invisible to history books that hadn't yet seen them. The frozen sky released them over open sea. Stigler maintained station, colder air biting his aircraft too. Low altitude over the North Sea exposed them to new dangers. Unpredictable weather pockets, icing threats on control surfaces, fuel misjudgment due to low pressure, and engine shutdown risk from vibration imbalance. No radio, no surrender, no rescue, just engines talking in fractured growl lines. But the pub flew on. He stayed beside it still, guarding nothing less than 10 human lives riding inside a plane that should have collapsed into history, but hadn't accepted punctuation. They flew over water where rescue was distant, but survival finally had a direction: west. The sea was no escape. It was a trial with no spectators. Crossing into open water over the North Sea, Olde Pub no longer fought for a target. It fought for a destination sentence that kept refusing a period. The bomber was holding 300 to 300 feet above the waves, dangerously low, but the only altitude its wounded lungs could suffocate the crew. The fighters that chased them earlier peeled away. The flak behind them did not. Inland defenses were structured like a web of fire channels, but coastal batteries were built for instant decisions. Anything slow, staggering, or lonely was an automatic verdict. The pub had been slow. It had been staggering. It was never truly alone. Stigler ensured that story never became fact. Franz Stigler had never escorted a bomber before. He had intercepted them, fired at them, blamed High Command for sending children into firewalled skies. He once said surviving morale in this war sometimes relies on stubborn calculation and humanity borrowed from the cold. That morning, calculation and humanity shook hands above 300 feet of lethal airspace. Brown glanced sideways through frost-fogged glass and saw a German aircraft sitting beside him like an unexpected shadow. Brown was wounded, unarmed in a practical sense, but not panicked. Panic assumes choice. Charlie Brown had no choices left. Only direction. West. Always west. When you run out of systems, you run on momentum and identity. His crew inside the bomb.
That's when Brown noticed something chilling. The fighter wasn't preparing for a kill approach. It was stabilizing a human decision mid-air. Stigler's formation was deliberate, a synchronized westbound claws protecting the aircraft from harbor targeting. Gravity has no mercy protocol. Pilots sometimes do. The bomber's descent had not triggered flak fire, but now altitude descent meant internal collapse risk from systems. Olde Pub had to maintain low altitude until landing ground lines were visible. But Brown wasn't seeing a ground. Brown was seeing a direction, lonely and infinite. West. Stigler had chosen west for him too. Not out of sentiment, but engineering empathy. The fighter hoped the view of such escort would deter coastal networks from committing fire. It worked. But emotional engineering was just beginning. And while no punishment manual could convince a trigger finger to hold, Stigler convinced his own finger with something colder than minus air.
Honor, not optics. They were out of German airspace, but they were not out of danger itself. Stigler kept flying wingman as the coastline disappeared behind them like a fading border between life and execution. By now, the Boeing bomber had become a slow mechanical fugitive, running west on wounded engines. The crew's oxygen was thin but working, barely. The hydraulics responded like an old hand waking up reluctantly. The electrical system was unreliable but not dead. The radio was silent. Silence is not consent. Silence is just a field waiting for a sound that never came. The North Sea at minus altitude is colder than minus weather. It flinches upward into the nerves. Brown's breath fogged the window instantly. He could see frost lining the rivets from leaking pressure holes along the fuselage, which Sadak later described as crystalline veins running across skin made of aluminum. At 400 feet over water, altitude is no longer vertical. It is a countdown strip. A bomber built by Boeing is resilient, but resilience has a tolerance limit. The Pub exceeded almost all mechanical tolerances that morning, except one: forward momentum west. Flak bursts create shrapnel fields, but icing creates control surface loss. Over the North Sea, an aircraft faces icing threats fast, especially at low altitude where there is little thermal variance. Any frost inside control lines can stiffen cables or freeze valves. Brown knew this, but worrying needs oxygen too, and oxygen was rationed inside the bomber. Luke suggested climbing again. Brown declined verbally over dead intercom lines. Luke was monitoring altitude lines that refused retrieval. The aircraft was flying too low to be noticed by the long-range chain-fire radar grid systems. But visibility is not the danger at 400 feet. Randomness is the danger. When the sea wants a bomber, it doesn't ask for paperwork. It simply waits. Stigler flew close, not emotional close, engine close. He was anticipating flak nets near England harbors might see the bomber and fire by mistaken identity. And mistaken identity over water is not a paperwork problem. It is a mortality problem. So he stayed. Again. Longer. Colder. Not calling for surrender, but guarding against randomness misread by observers below. Brown assumed this was temporary mercy. It was not mercy. It was a method. A manual override by a fighter pilot who had learned that descending aircraft under minus turbulence should not draw fire the same way they draw frost. The bomber was 250 miles from England. Sadak checked maps visually from the bomber nose. No landmarks, only ocean and compass lines shaking between damage and refusal. Jennings later recalled that recoil firing from a damaged Ma Deuce M2 Browning system might fully rupture fuselage electrical stability. They did not fire again, not because they trusted Stigler, but because firing might destroy themselves faster than sea level altitude. They crossed the North Sea in a cold convoy of deviations. Brown was trying to maintain control. Jennings and Yelisanko were rewiring guns. Peshout was trying to revive radio circuits manually, but the sea was more dramatic than all circuits combined. The oxygen frame kept icing around hardware loops. Stigler had no oxygen system failures, but he had something colder: imagination empathy, triggered at the last possible moment. He imagined Ye Olde Pub being shot by flak observers below. He imagined its crew descending in parachute like falling toys the ocean would write off. He imagined a more severely damaged aircraft not making it to England. But tortured imagination didn't finish him. It finished his sortie mission. He would not fire the inevitable period at a dying bomber if combat offered no return honor clause. So the fighter held station until England was a physical possibility. When they were far enough out over open water, Brown glanced again at Stigler. The fighter's fuel tolerance was crossing its own limit too. That's when Stigler pulled back, saluted, and returned eastbound. But that salute would come later. This moment, right now, still holding 400 feet of injured certainty. The bomber was no longer measured by guns or optics. It was measured by a flight line only heroes usually earn. A fragile return corridor engineered by a pilot who stayed beside his wounded enemy. The English coastline finally appeared, not like land, but like permission. Brown had rehearsed hundreds of landings. None looked like this. The bomber came in battered, systems growling at the seams, frost still clinging to bolts like evidence refusing to melt. Without nose plexiglass, the wind punched inside the cockpit, ripping instruments into a blur of trembling needles. Luke called out altitude. Colombe balanced engines manually, trimming power asymmetry like surgeons stitching mechanics mid-flight. The landing gear descended with a groaning certainty, metal negotiating another improbability it simply couldn't refuse anymore. They touched down at an airbase used by the 448th Bomb Group near Norfolk. Not home, but safe. And safety, that morning, had no postal code. The runway trembled under wounded aluminum wheels. The moment of contact wasn't gentle. It was catharsis delivered through impact. Years later, crew members swore the bounce felt like the plane exhaling one final shudder of protest before accepting grammar's grammar. The bomber rolled unevenly, leaning slightly, like a comma exhausted after pages of chaos. Ground crews rushed in, confused at first whether they should salute the aircraft or tow its remains directly off history's sightline. The men climbed out into air warmer than the sky above Germany, but colder than disbelief itself. Every crew member survived, except Eckenrode. 10 lives walking away from the inevitable period fire batteries expected in the sky.
Debriefing officers decided the incident could not be spoken loudly. The Air Force wanted headlines of resilience, formation discipline, and righteous momentum. An enemy fighter escorting a crippled bomber didn't fit the morale architecture at the time. It looked too fragile for ideological storytelling, so the report was classified, known but unspoken, whispered among investigators, never for cameras. Not yet. This story needed a future to earn its permission clause. Decades passed. The pilot and the ace, one American, one German, collided again, not in fire, but coincidence. In 1986, at an event known as Gathering of the Eagles, Brown finally told his side. The reaction split the room. Disbelief, curiosity, astonishment, skepticism. Even Brown questioned his own memory. The wound and hypoxia that day had blurred details in minutes. He needed proof of himself, not imagining sky geometry into ethics. Then the letter came. In 1990, a German veteran pilot wrote back. Franz Stigler confirmed every mechanical and ethical detail Brown carried hazy recollection of. The ace had been living in Canada near the Pacific coast, Vancouver. Brown, meanwhile, was in Seattle, near enough that geography added a chilling plot twist on coincidence. Two pilots bound by a classified convoy of frost, humility, war narration, and survival geometry living just 200 miles apart. They met, not like veterans, but like a footnote and headline finally shaking hands. Stigler never escorted again. Brown never forgot again. Sometimes the sky classifies stories pilots refuse to fire period on. The truth returns later, not an explosion, but parallel conscience.